Actually, first, the title of this talk is a little grandiose in that I'm not going to try to talk about the whole world, only the part of it that I know something about, which is Europe. But I suspect that many of the experiences that Europeans have had with nations and nationalism apply to most of the rest of the world as well. I'd like to begin by going back 28 years to the Year of Miracles, as it was called, the East European Revolution of 1989, which I suspect many of you still vividly recall. Although this great upheaval.
You know, a mic would be welcome if you would.
Okay. Okay.
It's on, I think.
It's on? Okay. Does it make a difference? Am I holding it close enough? Some things I'm experienced with and some things not. But.
I think the tippet parts
Like that?
Yeah. Now.
Very good. Okay. This great upheaval, which seemed once to mark a great turning point in all of history, the end of history, as one famous book put it, seems to have receded somewhat in our consciousness, even for those of us who lived through it, overshadowed since then by other concerns like radical Islam and the like. But from a long-term historical perspective, that revolution remains a really big deal, sure to loom large in history books written even 100 years from now. We still have books then, which probably should have mentioned that in such a nice library. But because that revolution and its immediate aftermath, which included the breakup of the satellite empire in Eastern Europe, the reunification of Germany, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself, those were things that weren't just momentous in themselves, but quite without parallel in all of recorded history. Never before, so far as I know, had an empire as large and powerful as the Soviet one come apart, collapse, so suddenly without suffering military defeat. Never before in all of history, as far as we know, have had so many apparently well-entrenched authoritarian regimes collapse so quickly amidst relatively little bloodshed, as did the 8 communist regimes in Eastern Europe in 1989. Never before had history witnessed such an ambitious program of social engineering, ideologically driven effort to remake the economy, society, people themselves, pressed on such a scale over so many decades at such a terrible cost in human lives, all the time proclaiming itself the future of us all, only to go poof, as it were, in 1981 and 1991. These were things that had never happened before, and which I'm sure none of us ever expected to see in our lifetimes. I want to focus today on just one particular, somewhat neglected aspect of these events, namely the role of nationalism in them. To begin with, the East European revolutions of 1989, while they had plenty of obvious causes, economic dysfunction, political repression, the end of the Brezhnev doctrine and all of that, they also had a nationalistic aspect. They were also driven by a nationalist desire for independence from a scarcely disguised Russian empire, communist or not. I mean, this was especially the case in the country I know best, Poland, where I happened to be in 1989. And that was, of course, you recall, the country that kicked off the chain reaction of revolutions that year. Recall, secondly, that one of these 8 countries that you see on the map not only rejected communism, but its own existence as a separate state when the citizens of the absurdly named German Democratic Republic, in one of their first free acts, voted overwhelmingly to merge with the West German state created in 1949. Despite a very determined 40-year effort to create a separate East German consciousness, which a lot of Western observers had bought into, by the way. So score another point for nationalism. Thirdly, while one could spend weeks analyzing the many flaws and shortcomings and unsavory aspects of the Soviet system, as I used to do in teaching Russian history, from, again, I guess you know the litany, bureaucratic sclerosis, economic failure, gerontocratic leadership, no offense to gerontocracy, the cost of empire, satellite, you remember all the reasons that people gave for the failure of the Soviet experiment. None of those problems by themselves would have meant the end of the Soviet Union. That was due to the revival or persistence of ethnic nationalism among the many peoples of the Soviet Union. As you may recall, the immediate cause of the end of the Soviet Union in December 1991 were the declaration of independence by most of the 15 constituent republics of the Soviet Union. Here's a map of the old Soviet Union and showing you the 15 Soviet Socialist republics that made up that union. All of them today are independent states. By the way, there's a huge irony here in that the fault lines along which the Soviet Union broke up, those republics, those boundaries separating those republics, were created largely from scratch by Lenin's communist regime in 1922. The boundaries themselves were mainly the work of Lenin's People's Commissar of Nationalities, whose name you may know, Joseph Stalin. Okay, Joseph Stalin. Most of these boundaries, most of those republics had never existed before. No history to them. As far as we can tell, Stalin just took an ethnic map of the Soviet Union, sort of like this, and drew lines on it to demarcate the different nationalities, never imagining that these lines might one day define independent states. As they do today. And a fourth point. Recall that the demise of the USSR was followed quickly by the breakup of two other 73-year-old creations, states that were both creations of the ill-fated Peace of Paris of 1919, namely Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The Czech-Slovak divorce in 1992 was by mutual consent and didn't attract a lot of outside attention, but Yugoslavia's protracted breakup, lasting from 1991 down to 2008, and producing 7 countries, where there had once been one, was much less amicable, and indeed included the first real wars that Europe had seen since 1945. In other words, it was ethnic nationalism that finally finished off these 3 multinational states, and it was nationalism also, especially during the wars of Yugoslav disunion, and also don't forget the Chechen War and other wars in the new Russia. It was nationalism that was soon being lamented as the chief downside to Eastern Europe's otherwise inspiring recovery of freedom, as it was called. Because that apparently included the liberation of the nationalist passions that communist regimes had kept a lid on for many years, but had never really resolved. It soon became evident that nationalism itself, far from being the spent or obsolete force that many Europeans and many academics, many academic students of nationalism had come to believe it was, despite the best efforts of
European elites to create supranational institutions and supranational loyalties, that nationalism was still very much with us, that we apparently still live in a world of nations. Here's the current map of Europe, and it consists, I'll explain later, almost entirely of nation states, almost all ethnically based nation states. And just for the record, the title of this is not A World of Nations. After all, oh boy, it's not a celebration of that. It's just historians have to deal with, evidence, the truth, as we know it. Some of you may recall what an awkward time this was for the scholars, most of them political or social scientists, working in the academic subdiscipline known as Soviet studies or Sovietology. It was not just that field effectively disappeared with the USSR, but that these scholars were so blindsided by all of these developments. Western Sovietologists, until that point, were virtually unanimous in the belief that the Soviet enterprise, for all of its faults, was at least partially successful, enjoyed considerable public support, had problems, but they could be solved, and in any case, it was surely here to stay. And that assumption turned out to be not just mistaken, but pretty darn embarrassing professionally. As Professor Alfred Meyer, University of Michigan professor Alfred Meyer, a major figure in that field, a leading voice in the field of Soviet studies, as he conceded at the time, and I want to quote, "Every important event that has taken place in the communist world within the last few years has come as a surprise to the professional students of the USSR and its client states." I bring this up, by the way, only because a similar point might be made about the more loosely defined academic field of nationalism studies, which is where my interest chiefly lies. It was similarly wrong-footed by the revival or persistence of ethnic nationalism after 1989, and not just in Eastern Europe. Much of the written version of this paper, by the way, consists of a closer examination of that literature, of the theoretical literature on nationalism, and trying to find out why and how it failed to anticipate the continuing force and appeal of the thing it was studying. That won't be of much interest to those who are not already familiar with the literature, so I'm going to skip over that and just offer the frank opinion that had you steeped yourself in that literature, in the pre-1989 literature on nationalism, you would have been no better prepared for its resurgence than a Soviet studies major prepared its students for the collapse of the communist project. Instead, since I am an historian, I'd like to turn back further still to some problems of nationalism in their historical context, which I hope will be interesting for their own sake, but also because they may help us understand and better come to terms with the continuing problems posed by nationalism in our own times. By historical coincidence, the East European Revolution of 1989, which reminded us of the continuing force of nationalism, erupted exactly 200 years after the equally momentous French Revolution of 1789, which in the view of most historians marked the arrival of nationalism as a major driving force in history. True, parenthetically, you can find expressions of ethnic pride and patriotism, other quasi-nationalist sentiments long before 1789. The plays of Shakespeare, the Lutheran Reformation in Germany, the Hebrew Bible, ancient Greece. But I think it's fair to say that political history until that time, until the 18th century, was always dominated by loyalties to other things: dynasty, empire, religious community, social class loyalty, not to nation. But when the French revolutionaries proclaimed liberty, equality, fraternity, it was the fraternity part that signaled nationalism. That reflected the then novel idea that modern states should not just be agglomerations of individuals who all obey the same laws or whatever, that they should also be national communities linked by a common sense of national identity, national purpose, and quasi-fraternal obligation to one another. And it was that national idea, moving quickly forward, that seemed to power the early successes of the French revolutionary armies and then those of Napoleon Bonaparte. I have a brief map here that left Bonaparte in charge, virtually in charge, master of most of Europe by 1807. That's the map here. But then it was also nationalism. As other countries picked up on the national idea, it was nationalism that helped power their final victory over French imperialism in 1815. Of course, nationalism is also one of the more freely employed and loosely defined terms that we regularly make use of. And so let's make some distinctions. First of all, I think we need to distinguish nationalism from the more generic idea of patriotism. By patriotism, we mean just the general tendency of most people to support and take pride in their own country, however that country is defined, whatever kind of a state you live in. If you're wondering about the image here, the word patriotism comes from the Latin word for father, or fatherland, patria, but for some reason all the fatherlands choose female figures to represent themselves. But nationalism, as opposed to patriotism, at least as that idea is figured in modern history, includes also identification not just with a state, but with an ethno-cultural community, and that's a big concept, a big word, big idea, but called the nation, to which one belongs regardless of formal citizenship. I think that's the essential idea of nationalism. In other words, we have a nationality as well as citizenship in a state. And the two loyalties may or may not coincide. I think of the old Soviet passports in the Soviet Union. People had to carry on internal passports. And on one line it said citizenship, and it was usually Soviet. On another line it said nationality, and there you found Ukrainian, Latvian, Uzbek, or something like that. Now for Americans, this distinction may not register because in this country, citizenship of the American Republic has traditionally created American national identity, formed national identity. But in Europe and in much of the rest of the world, the failure of state and nation to coincide has been a common problem and a source of much conflict and discord, and has led to numerous wars. I think the war going on right now in eastern Ukraine can be defined in that term, state versus nation. Because the essential nationalist view is that loyalty to nations should take precedence over loyalty to state when they conflict. Indeed, the logic of the national idea is that the only really legitimate states are nation states, states that see themselves as political representatives of a particular pre-existing nation. Okay. Next, I think we should distinguish between two variations on the national idea. The kind of nationalism that the French Revolution represented is usually called civic or political nationalism. It evolved more from historical and political conditions than on a clear ethno-cultural foundation. And even where such ethno-cultural community exists today, this may have been more the result than the cause of the original act of state creation. In other words, in these places like France, other countries you could put in this category would be Britain, Spain, Canada, and of course the United States. In these places, the state seems to have come first and then produced the nation by imposing a official language, establishing schools that teach a common history, just centuries of assimilation and indoctrination and habit. But ethnic nationalism has been the more common and certainly the more disruptive form that nationalism has assumed in the modern era. By the way, did you notice that each of those civic national states that I just mentioned is currently facing a significant domestic ethno-national challenge, as in Scotland, Corsica, Catalonia, Quebec. The only one that doesn't face such a challenge right now, so far at least, is the United States. Although the demographic basis for such a challenge may well be building as we speak. But the picture, who is this fellow here? The philosophical foundations of ethnic nationalism were laid mainly by the man pictured here, the 18th century German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder, who also gave us the word nationalism. Herder argued that the world's various ethnic cultures were reflections of unique personalities, or if you call them the national spirit of the world's nations, and that these were part of God's creation. He was a pastor, and they should be respected and defended. He encouraged Europe's nations, especially the smaller nations of Eastern Europe. Most of them had never had a state of their own. He encouraged them to resist homogenization, to preserve their national languages and cultures, their ethnic distinctiveness, in order that one day, when history called upon them to make their particular contribution to the general progress of humanity, they would have something authentic and undebased to offer. That was the essence of Herder's message. Herder's name is not widely known to Americans, I'm guessing, but in addition to being the father of nationalism, he ranks among the major thinkers in Eastern Europe today still. I think maybe because he forecast a wonderful future for the Slavic peoples if they would hold on to their ethnic distinctiveness. Slavic peoples aren't used to having German philosophers say that about them. So, but Herder, in this next point, Herder was concerned almost exclusively with the cultural bases of nationality, language, literature, folk traditions, and things like that. He did not think it was essential for every nation to have a state of its own. He wasn't concerned about it. His fellow Germans at the time did not have their own state. Indeed, much of what this father of nationalism wrote is really not that far removed from what the multiculturalists say today. The inherent value of ethnic culture. So I think we should also distinguish this cultural form of ethnic nationalism from the more political forms it later assumed, although it's not a very big conceptual jump from the idea that celebrating one's own unique cultural identity to the idea that it should also have its own political personality, its own state, to express and defend that identity. And that is where things began to get sticky. It was a third of the great European revolutions, the European-wide revolutions of 1848, that saw the first efforts to apply Herder's originally cultural, unpolitical notion of nationalism to the political map of Europe. Does this work? Okay. The map of the revolution of 1848. Leaders of Europe's national groups came forward that year, during the turmoil of that year, and laid claim to the lands which they thought should form the geographical basis of their national existence. That was revolutionary in itself because nation states, where nation and state roughly coincided even roughly, France, for example, or Sweden, countries like that, they made up only a minority of 19th century European states. In part, we suspect, in those cases, because they had been around for so long, they'd been able to mold their peoples into reasonably coherent national communities. But most 19th century Europeans, and here I'm putting side by side a political map of Europe in 1815, and on the other side the ethnic situation, and you notice especially in the central and eastern part of Europe, there's simply no correlation between the two. Most Europeans clearly did not live in nation states in the 19th century. Most of them lived either in large dynastic empires like the Austrian, the Russian, and the Ottoman, gathered together over the centuries by conquest or inheritance and containing a great variety of peoples, or as in the case of Germany and Italy, before their unification in 1860 and 1871 respectively, they lived in quite small states that made up only a small part of their national group. But nationalist intellectuals who played a prominent role in the revolution of 1848 believed that it would be a relatively simple matter, things always seem simple to ideologues, a relatively simple matter to create a Europe of nation states by just redrawing the political maps, or like Stalin later did with the Russian Empire. The problem here, I think you already anticipate some of the problems. The problem, in addition to the understandable reluctance of states not based on the national principle to just disappear, the problem here was that there turned out to be a distressingly large number of places to which more than one national group laid claim. A lot of modern history right there. And that was because, I think, the categories of nationalism, the nation, nationality, ethnicity itself, these were kind of vague, and they were certainly open to interpretation. And let me give you a couple of examples. These are problems that are inherent in the very idea of nationalism. The idea creates the problems, the idea has no answer for the problems. Okay. Sometimes historical conflicts are that simple. One example, before people could claim the right of national self-determination, somebody had to decide the size and shape of the territory where this decision was to be made. The classic example of this problem in 1848 was the German-Czech dispute over the Austrian province of Bohemia. You see that on the map there. The population of Bohemia was about 2/3 Czech and about 1/3 German. And each side claimed the place on the principle of nationality. The German view was that Bohemia had always been part of the German Empire. At the time, it was part of the German Confederation. That's that black line you see here. It was inside the German Confederation. And such historic entity should remain intact, and the Germans were the majority there. The Czech view was that Bohemia was a historic entity. It should remain intact, and Czechs were the majority there. As you know, the Czech position eventually prevailed in 1919, and Bohemia became the basis of the new state of Czechoslovakia. When the Germans tried to use the same argument that the Czechs had used to get out of Austria to get out of Czechoslovakia, here is the part of Bohemia and Moravia with majority German populations at the time. When they tried to use that same argument, they got nowhere until Hitler took up their cause in 1938. And we're getting into areas that you're all familiar with, I think. The Sudetenland, it was called. Germans got their way in 1938. That lasted exactly 7 years. And then came 1945, and the two-thirds of Bohemians who were Czech, with the approval, I should add, of the United States and its allies, decided to resolve this issue once and for all by simply expelling and dispossessing the 1/3 of German Bohemians who were German. So the Czech Republic is wonderfully homogeneous today, but got that way by ethnic cleansing. For a contemporary example of this same problem, I hope I'm not oversimplifying here too much, you might look at the Northern Irish problem. Isn't that what that is about? The Irish say the island of Ireland is the operative unit, and we're the nationalists a majority here, and the Northern Irish say, the Protestants at least say, the Unionists say that Northern Ireland is the operative unit, and we're the majority there. Well, you can take sides, but I'm not sure that the logic of there's a necessary answer to that dilemma. Okay. And this was just one of the dilemmas created by the idea of nationalism. Another one, the second one, when it came to assigning nationality to people as opposed to territory, that could be just as tricky, because for many people, and I don't think this issue has gone away today, for many people, nationality was something more or less objective. You were Polish if you looked, you don't look Polish, but if you spoke Polish or acted Polish. In other words, other people thought you were Polish. That was basically what made you Polish. For others, however, nationality was essentially subjective. It was in your mind. What made you Polish, it was a matter of personal sentiment or individual will. What made you Polish was you felt yourself part of the Polish nation, regardless of the language you spoke or the state you belonged to or what other people thought of you, right? Objective versus subjective nationality. The classic example of this dilemma in 19th century Europe was the province of Alsace, part of eastern France here, see on the left map. The situation was this: more than 90% of Alsatians spoke German. The place, I think, looked German. That's why there's a picture of it here. And it had been part of Germany until Louis XIV conquered it and annexed it in the 17th century. Subsequently, however, many, probably most Alsatians came to feel at home in France. They continued to speak German, but they saw themselves as citizens of the French nation. But in the eyes of German nationalists, they remained objectively German, and so in 1871, when Prussia defeated France, you know, Bismarck took Alsace and added it to his new German empire. In the eyes of French nationalists, the French nationalists continued to see Alsatians as subjectively French, so in 1919, when Germany was defeated, France took it back. That wasn't the end of the story. In 1940, when Germany defeated France, Germany took it back, and in 1945, when Germany was defeated, and you get the picture. Unfortunately, the several national conflicts that erupted in mid-19th century Europe, like the two I just discussed, Bohemia and Alsace, were just the tip of a huge iceberg. Because, next point, in the western half of Europe, roughly speaking, areas of national conflict remained relatively few and isolated. Because in Western Europe, most Western Europeans tended to live in relatively well-defined ethnic blocks. The map here just conveys that impression, doesn't it? They lived in states that had been around for a long time, and they were often separated by natural frontiers as well. But when you move into the eastern half of Europe, the situation changes radically. As you can see on this map, first of all, the frontiers of the Eastern empires bore no relationship at all, they're black here on this map, to the ethnic situation. Eastern Europeans were also less likely to live in solid ethnic blocks. You just see that this is a very simplified map, but the peoples were often scrambled together. It was not uncommon to find one nationality dominating the city and another one the surrounding countryside. There were enclaves of people far from their territorial home, like the light blue is German. You can see little bits of Germans all around Eastern Europe. There were sizable ethnic groups in Eastern Europe, such as the Jews and the Roma, who had no territorial home at all in Europe. In other words, the nationalist goal of a Europe and a world of nationally homogeneous nation states created a number of problems in Western Europe. But in Eastern Europe, we think this notion was just, it was first of all, incompatible with the continued existence of three huge empires, the Austrian, the Austro-Hungarian, and then the Ottoman. And we just think it was impossible to begin with. The European power most discomfited by the rise of ethnic nationalism, I'm sure you're all aware, was Austria-Hungary, which suffered from a kind of terminal diversity. And this very colorful map, I think, tells you why. What do you do with this in an age of nationalism? There are 11 different, they found 12, okay, 12 different nations here, each of which has their own state today, which the Habsburgs tried to hold together in one empire. Actually, when the problem was that nationalism was one of those classic ideas whose time has come that one encounters in history, an idea that comes along, and whether it's comfortable or makes a lot of sense, it's just so powerful it sweeps all before it. Traditional ties, the current state system, economic rationality, common sense, and everything. I think that's the best way to see nationalism in the modern era. Conflict between the national idea and the existing state system, especially in Eastern Europe, became simply the most explosive force in modern European history. It was among other things, it led directly to the First World War, and when Europe's nationalist leaders, at the close of that conflict, were finally able to redraw the map, more or less along ethnic lines. This was their effort in 1919, closer but not quite exactly the same as the ethnic map. But frankly, they did such a bad job of it that they simply created the basis for another war 20 years later. And that awful war included the new horrors of genocide and ethnic cleansing, which some people see as the final logic of the national idea is maybe ethnic cleansing. As I said, in today's Europe, the countries that most approximate the nationalist idea of ethnically homogeneous nation states, Poland as well as the Czech Republic, got that way by expelling their once very numerous, very sizable minority populations. Actually, when considering the historical record of nationalism, the history of nationalism, it's pretty negative. If you look at European history between 1848 and 1945, it's not hard to see why reasonable people thought enough of this, or we should move beyond this. And it's not hard to see why accommodating, well-meaning scholars tried to accommodate this desire by coming up with analyses and theories which suggested that people were actually already moving away from nationalism and it was fading as a problem. Which brings us back up to 1989, when the confident assertions of many academics that nationalism was a passing phase in human history, whose hold was already weakening. Those are quotes, by the way, from the literature. Again, there's not time to go into individual scholars here. You wouldn't want to do that, but there are numerous citations of works of these scholars in the written version of this paper. Those assumptions were brutally challenged by the sudden resurgence of nationalism. There's only one scholar I want to mention by name here, because he offered an explanation for the apparent disconnect between the world of nationalist theory and the nationalist world in which we live. I refer to the late Isaiah Berlin, who's a pretty well-known public intellectual, whose name some of you may know. He also wrote an important book on Herder, and he had a certain special interest in nationalism. And in an article he published, Isaiah Berlin was mainly a British citizen who spent his career at Oxford University, but by background, he came from Latvia. He was Jewish, born Jewish in Latvia, which was then the Russian Empire. So he had lots of personal experience with ethnic nationalism in Eastern Europe. And in an article published 10 years before the East European Revolution of 1989, Berlin presented a persuasive an explanation for why so many scholars of nationalism had been inclined to discount underestimate the historical force of their chosen subject. And he basically applied a class analysis to that. He suggested the reason was, as members of the class, traditionally placed the greatest faith in reason, the class we call the intelligentsia, or less reverentially, the chattering class. Berlin found that these scholars, well-meaning though they were, just instinctively preferred the idea of national identity rooted in a civic polity of informed citizens, possessed of at least some individual choice in the matter. That was more appealing than the idea of ethnic nationality rooted in a quasi-tribal order where you're just born into it and have no choice, okay? In other words, nationalism of a civic or political type that I mentioned before, that might still be okay, and historically that kind of nationalism has been associated with other good things like general emancipation, liberalism. The original nationalism had also an internationalist dimension. You weren't just demanding freedom for your people, but for all people. Okay. That was okay. But ethnic nationalism, which has been associated more with conservatism, and so is not okay, and the reliance, its reliance on the vagaries of language and culture, you know, what exactly are those things, rather than explicit laws and institutions of a civic state, just made that kind of nationalism seem less safe. And of course, the view that the only legitimate states were nation states promised not just the radical political reorganization of Europe, but in fact it seemed to augur an epidemic of insurrections and wars, and that's what history suggested happened. That was borne out by nationalism's role in the wars of the 20th century. Not to mention the havoc wrought by states that actually tried to make themselves into ethnic national communities instead of civil societies. Imperial Germany, interwar Poland, places like that tried to turn themselves into ethnic national communities, despite the fact that they had very diverse populations. Berlin's point here, and I think it's one we can all share, is that scholars should not let their disapproval of an idea, such as nationalism, cause them to underestimate or ignore its historical force. Because when we turn from the world of nationalist theory to the world as it actually is today, I think this is what we find, and I'll conclude with these several observations that I think are factual. I believe they're factual and not just mere opinion. These several points. First of all, let me go ahead to the contemporary world. Again, you can see today's map of Europe coincides much more closely to the ethnic map, especially in Eastern Europe, than it used to. The 3 points. First of all, for the first time in its entire history, Europe now consists, I think it's evident, almost exclusively of nation states. States that see themselves and are seen by others as political expressions of a particular nation. While ethnicity may not inspire all manifestations of nationalist consciousness in Europe and elsewhere, I mentioned some civic nationalist cases before, there are exceptions. In fact, it does seem to be the basis of most European nation states. In fact, they're based on ethnicity. And while other than ethnic states, the ones I mentioned, may persist in Western Europe, that's where they all are, we should not forget that such states were once common in the rest of Europe as well, except they've all disappeared there. First there was the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire after World War I. But then, as I pointed out at the beginning, several of the states that took their places, multinational empire states of their own, USSR, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, they've gone now too. They too have capitulated to the forces of ethnic nationalism. And their disappearance may be even more instructive than what happened to Austria-Hungary, because I'm thinking here obviously of the Soviet Union, those states had very powerful means of persuasion at their disposal and little hesitation to use them, as you may recall. So what does it tell us? That even the ruthlessly totalitarian Soviet Union could not prevail over the forces of ethnic nationalism, could not survive it. What does that tell us? Secondly, a few would argue that, as some nationalists did in the 19th century, that your language determines your national identity. A common language, as we know, may kind of invite people to see themselves as a national community, but it doesn't oblige them to do so. Other factors may affect that. In today's world, today's Europe, the classic example would be the Croatians, the Bosnians, and the Serbs, who all speak the same language. They don't like to admit it today, but they all speak the same language. It's called, on this map, Serbo-Croatian, but they differ by religion and history, and they don't want to live together. So other things may, and then there's always, of course, Switzerland is always a great exception. In Switzerland, you have 4 languages and one very successful nation. So obviously, you can't say language equals ethnicity equals nationality. But yet again, just going back to the empirical evidence, facts as we see them today, language does seem to be the leading indicator of nationality in most of Europe. Anywhere east of the Rhine River, most of Switzerland lies west of it, language coincides with national identity to a historically unprecedented degree. On a map like the one on the right here, it says languages in Europe, and if you had an ethnic map of Europe, it would look virtually the same. And that, I think, is that's a singular and I think very remarkable, though little remarked upon, historical development that would be inconceivable in earlier centuries. But it's happened. And thirdly, third point, nationalism itself, in the general sense that most people identify with political or cultural communities called nations and believe that national interests and values should take precedence over competing claims. That still seems to be the majority view, at least outside of the chattering class. National loyalties, in some parts of the world, these may be called ethnic or tribal or something like that, but they derive from, I think, the same source. National loyalties demonstrate a continuing ability to, as Claire put on the flyer, to defy the most powerful regimes like the Soviet and to confound the most sophisticated intellectual elites like the great, huge body of scholars who study nationalism. The national loyalties continue to engender levels of individual commitment and group action that advocates of other kinds of solidarity, such as class solidarity, gender solidarity, can only fantasize about. Only religion seems to exercise a comparable appeal. In short, the nation remains, for most people, I believe, what Harvard political scientist Rupert Emerson once called the terminal community, not lethal, but terminal, and the last one, terminal community. He defined that as the largest community that when the chips are down, commands people's loyalties. For which reason we are likely to continue for some time at least living in a world of nations, after all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Could I expand a little bit on your discussion on the breakup of the Soviet Union?
Yeah.
Uniqueness that you may not have, given it all the necessary uniquenesses. The 3 Baltic states, they are not Slavic. They've always had a Western kind of a leaning orientation. Their religion and their language and so forth has always been towards the Western Europe, England and Germany and Sweden and so forth. The reason why, and as you pointed out, they were part of the Soviet Union, that was no specific decision on the part of these 3 little Baltic states.
They were conquered.
In a sense, Stalin forced the issue, I think during the conference of Yalta, where he simply told Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Churchill, Though, that's the part of Europe that I want, including Poland, the 3 Baltic states, and most of the Eastern and Southern Europe. So the 3 Baltic states have been kind of festering under the Soviet rule. Their nationality and their language and their religion and their alphabet has always been Western. Now for the last 40 or 50 years, they have been forced to, in a sense, accept and suffer under the Moscow rule. So when the Soviet Union broke up, those were the first 3 countries that immediately said, hey, we want our country back, because the 3 countries were independent republics, democratic republics from the 1920s to 1930s. And during the war, if I can use the expression, when the Germans came, the Russians came in first in the Baltic states, then the Germans counterattacked and threw the Russians out. The cooperation that some of the Latvians felt towards the Germans was one of those philosophies of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In other words, both of those were antagonistic towards the Baltic states. The question was, with only 2 million people in each of these 3 countries, there's no way they could exist on their own. So, and that's why for 50 years they suffered under the Soviet rule and were the first to immediately declare their independence, their nationality, their language. I mean, it's not a Slavic language, it's an Indo-European language. So to them, to be under 50 years of this, the nationalism was the greatest thing that could happen to them. So that's why you can see the map on the left shows the Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia exactly in the same location as you show their languages.
Yeah.
So the language and the people are exactly where they want to be. They do not want to expand any further. And I just wanted to expand to Europe.
I agree with all that. That's true.
You know, your great discussion on the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Guess who was born in Latvia?
Guess who spent part of his career in Latvia?
Pardon me?
Who spent part of his career in Latvia? Johann Gottfried Herder. That's
I'm
right.
sorry, what?
Herder, the fellow I mentioned, the
Yeah.
father of nationalism,
Right,
was a
right,
Protestant
right.
Lutheran pastor in Riga.
Yeah.
And the Latvians were exactly the people he had in mind when he said, you haven't had a state before, but hold on to your ethnicity and you'll have one one day.
Yeah.
So you've given a really brilliant historical overview of the past, which most of our young people have no clue at all about, including my children, who are fairly well educated.
My children know a lot.
But my question, it has to do with the successful throwing off of the yoke of communism from the Eastern European countries that were behind the Iron Curtain after World War II, and the forces of nationalism, as you've described, were extremely important in accomplishing that. And also the breakup of the Soviet Union, similarly. So there were obvious benefits to the various types of nationalism that you've talked about. The question now, though, is those forces are building again in various countries. And after World War II, after the horrendous slaughter of the 2 world wars, there's a consensus, in the West at least, that certain international organizations should be established to rein in and control and try to prevent war, to integrate the world partially at least economically, reduce trade barriers, do things that would hopefully discourage or reduce the likelihood of yet a 3rd World War. But now, with Brexit and various, and you know, at the risk of making a political comment, making America great again, and various, it seems like these forces of nationalism in individual countries are rising, and they could challenge the institutions that have arguably at least been beneficial to the world as a whole. So I was going to say,
That's
are you
the
an
dilemma.
optimist? Are you an optimist
No, I
about
don't. No.
the future?
No, but you're quite right. I mean, history doesn't turn out the way we want it to be all the time, and so, but historians shouldn't let that shape their analysis. They owe us an objective, factual analysis. You have to understand the downside of nationalism, and also you can overdo it. You can just say nationalism itself is terrible. It has its good points. I mean, where would the whole when you analyze the history of those wonderful Northern European social democratic welfare states, you cannot separate that from a sense of national community at the beginning of those. And they can't exist in a globalized world. Whereas nationalism has its positive points too, but I think
your comments suggested that the Soviet republics that chose to break away from Soviet Union were largely a negative construct in reaction to the Soviet Union, as well as a positive construct reflecting their languages. But right now, there's this very, very serious international issue of the upsurge of Russian nationalism in persona of Putin, who seems to be pursuing this old-fashioned Russian military bullying approach. Does it seem to you that there is still the potential in these flyaway republics to build on their geographical proximity to Russia and the natural trade potential and other intercourse that's there?
when you say build upon, you mean that there'll be a.
Instead,
there
cut
economy
out the bullying and
Yeah.
focus on
Just natural
mutual
attraction.
respect
Yeah.
and building on
Yeah.
their proximity and their trade and business relationship.
The great to me, tragedy of Russian history is that Russian nationalism has so long been confused with Russian imperialism. So, there were signs that Putin was actually getting away from that.
Was?
Yeah, he was. He was by focusing on the ethnic Russian. That would produce a different kind of Russian nationalism. For centuries, Russian nationalism has meant dominating neighboring people. And it would be a huge improvement if they would just focus on Russians, even if that would help Ukrainians. But if they would just focus on the Russians.
So all those little countries around, well, not so
Yeah.
small territorially,
Yeah.
they're naturally within the
Yeah.
Russian orbit.
No, you're quite right. I mean, you're quite right that the economic tie, close economic ties with Russia should be automatic. The Russians would just kind of be more tactful.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's never been part of Russia to concentrate on its economic, its soft appeal. They've always tried the ham-handed approach, which is unfortunate.
Putin and Trump ought to get together and build some hotels.
They are.
Let's take this and apply it, looking at the United States and the huge influx of Spanish-speaking people from the South. And what are the implications for us as a nation insisting on one language? We've now got the Muslim population moving in from the Middle East, and I see just in Syracuse a community that very logically, rapidly forming. And how should we regard the language element of this?
Remember, I just have an historian, right? So he just said the historian looks backwards and he thinks backwards too.
But
This is not a plan at dinner time.
Concepts have been looked for.
You know, as a historian, when I see the disaster of all the political pundits in 1989, how totally wrong they were. Our libraries are full of shelves of books by Soviet experts that turn out to be totally useless. useless. It just makes me even less inclined to try to say anything about the future. I did, however, when I said the United States does not face an ethnic national challenge for now, but the demographic basis for one may be building. I was thinking of our Southwest. I mean, we could have a putback in the city of Quebec there for long. That's for other people to deal with. The notion that people freely give up their ethnicity. People don't like to give up their ethnicity. People who came to this country, great cost across the ocean, and they just reluctantly gave up their ethnicity. And when you're right next door to your home country, and you're living in communities where millions of people just like you, and you know you have to use the English language to get by, you won't give up your ethnicity. Sooner or later, ethnic groups tend to boil up and start demanding political independence. That's just the history of ethnic nationalism. Ms. Blanke.
Then how come that didn't happen all throughout the 19th century, still in places like central New York, where we had veritable enclaves of Polish speakers, Italian speakers, you did not, German speakers.
Yeah. You're right. I mean, there was
They
powerful
dissipated.
assimilationist ethos in this country for 2 centuries. And plus, the difference becoming, our ancestors came from what is today Poland, Germany, and it was miserable over there, and you didn't want to replicate that here, so you adapted. That has been the successful history of the United States until now, but I'm not sure with the different demographics of people arriving, the different numbers, the different cultures they come from, and plus elitists who have this multiculturalist notion. There's never been a successful multicultural democracy in this world that I know of. It's never happened. Having a society that runs with a multiplicity of cultures is like having a traffic system where you drive according to a multiplicity of traffic rules. It just doesn't work. But I share your trepidation that we could be kind of stumbling towards that.
What binds Canada together? Hockey.
I mean, the jury's still on that, right? I think we're all agreed we don't want this country to face that kind of a challenge.
Another quick question, going back to Europe. There is now the development of ultra-right-wing feelings in Austria, France, Hungary. That, in a sense, if developed in those particular countries, accentuates nationalism to the point of becoming unrealistic and to the point of becoming like we're greater than anybody else. And yet it seems like right-wing nationalism is on the upswing in some European countries. Where do you see this thing falling into place?
Again, I can't know the future, but I would say that nationalism is inherent in a lot of people. It's underneath, it's behind this. What you're talking about is the phenomenon, not the source.
But when it gets to the point that we're better than you are, then it's dangerous.
But how many people aren't once in a while tempted to think that about their country? Any other questions? Comments?
Thank you.